Good. Well, my name is Thomas Berman. I'm the director of the Medieval Institute here at the University of Notre Dame, and we are having a great deal of fun this year celebrating our 75th anniversary. We're the oldest interdisciplinary institute on the campus of Notre Dame, and we do all kinds of very interesting things, which I won't bore you with right now. But one of the ways we're celebrating this anniversary is by events like this that are aimed at a broader audience than just geeky academics like myself and some of my colleagues here, and in part to show that the Middle Ages, though distant in time, really do speak to the present in ways that are surprising. And that's what today's panel is about. We're very grateful to have with us Justin Hicks as the facilitator of this event, who is the workforce reporter for Indiana Public Broadcasting, the state's network of NPR and PBS affiliates. And throughout the pandemic, he's filed stories for National Public Radio on everything from unemployment insurance to laws around labor unions. And today he will facilitate this event about post-pandemic labor markets. So, Justin.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, and thank you all for coming today. As you can tell, I'm a little close to the microphone here. I'm used to speaking on the radio. I'm not used to seeing faces in front of me. I'm used to talking to the void, right? So one note I do want to mention, we will be recording this. We are recording this. We're going to rebroadcast this on your local NPR station, which here is WPVE. And we'll rebroadcast that Monday evening at 7 p.m. So if there's anything that you miss or you want to tell your friends, hey, this is a really great discussion, tune in. 7 p.m. WPVE 88.1. Now, of course, that means that your friends won't be able to see all of the acrobatics that we have behind us, of course, you know, and the flame jugglers and everything, because it's radio, right? You know, that can happen. Just pretend it's happening. So they won't be able to see that, but tell them to tune in if you want. And with that being said, too, just make sure your cell phones are on silent if they're not already, so that we don't, you know, get in the way of the recording there. So without further ado, though, let's get started. So today's program, it's a roundtable discussion on post-pandemic labor markets. To be clear, we're still currently in a pandemic, but today we're going to take a look at how history might help us understand labor market changes we're already seeing and maybe even help us anticipate some new changes that are yet to come. We'll explore parallels between our new normal these days and 14th century Europe, where the bubonic plague was rampant. We'll also compare the current perception of a worker shortage in present times with medieval work conditions and labor laws that came about in the wake of the Black Plague. So I hope you're excited as I am, but first, let's introduce this great lineup of panelists we have here. Daniel Hobbins, to my left, is an associate professor of history at Notre Dame. He specializes in the cultural and intellectual history of late medieval Europe, and under this broad heading, his research has focused on colophons, is that correct? Colophons? Yeah. Authorship, Joan of Arc, and backgrounds to print. Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you, and thanks for coming.
Yeah. On the other side of the table, Dan Graff. He's the director of the Higgins Labor Program, which is dedicated to the importance of the labor question to all human endeavors. That is, who does the work, who gets the fruits of that labor, and who makes the rules. His current research projects include labor licensing codes of conduct in contemporary American universities, race, labor, and citizenship in 19th century St. Louis, and representations of the chronic crisis facing workers in the US since 1981. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Justin. Happy to be here. And thanks to the Medieval Institute for hosting.
Yeah. And then finally joining us via Zoom, hovering above our heads here, we have Tamara Kay. She's a professor of global affairs in the Keough, I hope I'm saying that correctly, Keough School of Global Affairs, and holds an appointment in Notre Dame's Department of Sociology. Her research and teaching focus on the political and legal implications of regional economic integration, transnationalism, and global governance for labor and environmental movements, NGOs, and policy formation. Hi, Tamara.
Hello, everybody. Welcome home for some of you.
Right, so let's set the stage a little bit for where we're kind of at right now, before we kind of go back in time to the 14th century. Tamara, I'm going to throw this question at you. Hopefully you can hear me okay. First things first, can you explain to us what this term labor market means? We've kind of thrown that around a little bit, but what does that encompass when we talk about labor markets?
So a labor market, also known as a job market, is very simple. It's basically referring to the supply and demand of labor. And employees provide the supply and employers provide the demand. And some key indicators or variables we'd be interested in thinking about labor markets are at the macro level, at the sort of broader scale, unemployment rates and labor productivity rates. And at the micro scale, individual wages and numbers of hours worked, things like that.
Got it. And does that, I mean, that sounds like it involves maybe a lot of data crunching there, a lot of number crunching, or what kind of numbers do you look at specifically?
Yeah, so, the ones relevant to pre-COVID, post-COVID would be something like the unemployment rate. So actually the unemployment rate right before COVID began in February 2020 was about 3.5%. A month later in March, it was about 4.4%. And it peaked at a high of almost 15%, just under 15% in April 2020, which actually was the highest rate observed since data collection began in 1948. And then since then, we've seen a decline. The unemployment rate has fallen to about 5.4% as of July. And then another variable we look at is what we call labor force participation. So by April 2020, labor force participation had declined to about 60.2%, a level not seen since the early 1970s. And then we began a partial recovery in May 2020. So, we saw a decrease in jobs, in non-farm jobs. We saw different economic sectors impacted disparately, particularly in leisure and hospitality sectors. And we also saw differences in gender, bigger impacts on women, bigger impacts on people of color. And so those are the kinds of data that we're looking at.
Yeah, and the unemployment rate, I know that's a big one that we've talked about a lot in the past 2 years or so, but because it was historically low before the pandemic and then it suddenly became historically high. Can you explain a little bit of how do we capture that number? How does the Bureau of Labor Statistics, who publishes that, I know, what's the process they go about?
So every month they collect data on how many people are employed. And so the data is actually very good and very consistent. It's some of the best data that we actually have. And so it's looking at different sectors. It's looking at different genders. There are surveys of workers. And so we have a lot of information on a monthly basis in the United States about what's happening with the unemployment rate.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Dan Graff, I'm going to pass this over to you. So today we're seeing a lot in the media about a worker shortage, although that's kind of contested as well, right? I mean, it's not necessarily clear that there is a worker shortage, depending on who you ask. So, we drive around, we see this evidence when we're driving down the street and we see the Taco Bell and the KFC saying now hiring and, all these big signs. What's going on with that?
Yeah, I would say it's great to have Tamara as a sociologist tag teaming with me in the contemporary period. I'm a historian like Dan is, but a US historian and focus increasingly on contemporary labor questions. So, my answer to the question about a labor shortage is that it's yes and no. I mean, yeah, it's definitely true. Many employers are struggling to find workers. But at the same time, we have an official unemployment rate. I think now it's about 5.2%, about double for African Americans compared to whites. That's still higher than before the pandemic. And there's still 5 million fewer jobs in the US economy than there were prior to the pandemic, which suggests we haven't fully recovered as an economy. I think the way to reconcile that we have both millions of workers unemployed with employers unable to find workers is that we're in a really unsettled moment in the economy right now. We're still in the pandemic, as Justin said. There's all sorts of questions for workers about safety at the workplace, problems of parents or those who provide some kind of care to others in their home. How do they get care for the people that they are worried about with childcare possibly closed, all sorts of COVID-related issues of welcoming people into your home. Some schools are still not reopened or only partially reopened. So there's all sorts of reasons why some employers aren't finding workers as quickly as they'd become accustomed to before the pandemic. But I think, and this is where I put on my historian's hat, an additional and perhaps bigger factor is the chronic problem of pay in the United States. I mean, we have had persistent flat hourly wages for ordinary workers for the past 4 or 5 decades, and a complete decoupling of economic productivity from workers' wages. And we've continued to have this very productive economy despite the 2008 recession and the blip, the pandemic, which is significant as well. Despite that, we've had productivity gains over the last 10, 20, 30 years, but we haven't created that many good jobs to go along with those productivity gains. And workers in this pandemic / post-pandemic moment are increasingly hesitating to take crappy jobs that they would have in the past. Again, it's complicated, I think, what's going on, but we're seeing workers individually saying no more to the old employment relationship, the pre-pandemic employment relationship. And we are seeing some wages rise. We're seeing starting pay getting boosted, but we're seeing a lot of squawking by employers about having to pay those higher wages. I think it's a good thing that pay is rising, and maybe there's a perception of a labor shortage, especially in really low wage brackets. In a capitalist economy, demand for labor is supposed to produce higher wages to attract workers. And on some level, that's what we're seeing. I feel like employers and the public in the US are so unused, I guess, to that situation that they're flummoxed by this. And many are starting to cry foul. Workers don't want to work. The work ethic is disappearing in this country. But I think in the context of that flat pay for a generation, we're still playing catch up when it comes to wages going up. And I think we should be happy to see low wage workers both benefiting with some modest pay raises, as well as flexing muscle that causes inconvenience to us as consumers, frankly.
Yeah. Well, you talked about as well, people saying essentially, well, people are just lazy right now. People don't want to work. And I know in my reporting, I've reported a lot on unemployment insurance over the past year and a half. Something I've thought about a lot is, this idea of, the quote unquote welfare queen kind of myth that went around a lot, and that suddenly became attached in people's minds to unemployment insurance. Do you think there's sort of harmful, maybe stereotypes is the right word, that you think are attached to this idea of people are just lazy?
Yeah, I very much worry about that. I mean, it's the hospitality and the leisure sectors, I think, which create lots and lots of low-paid jobs with little room for advancement. These are the ones suffering the labor shortages the most. Hotel workers, food service workers, and they're just not accustomed to that. It's not just about low pay. Again, it's about the prospects for like what I would call sane scheduling, the ability to have a decent, predictable schedule, reliability of hours, as well as the notion that used to be very customary in the United States of upward mobility, the sort of internal job ladders within companies, career pathways. I have seen stories recently about employers, like just a sort of text analysis of job ads, where there's like a 30% boost in companies like Amazon and other firms that start people out at close to the bottom of the wage bracket, emphasizing more about benefits like tuition assistance, as well as just words like career path and training opportunities. So whether that's going to gain some larger traction and produce a longer trend, I don't know. But I think right now we're facing a reckoning over this sort of low wage, low price conundrum, and consumers are part of that equation. And I have gotten used to very cheap food and services and goods. And if wages go up and prices are going to have to go up as well, there's going to be some discomfort along the way. I mean, the last thing I'll say is I've been, troubled by this. I mean, I already am opposed to an economy rooted in tipping. So the idea that you have jobs that are tip based rather than, say, in Europe, where you work in a restaurant, you get paid a wage, there's no expectation of tip. You're not reliant upon the customer being good or bad, having a good or bad day as a worker. But in the US, we have this system. We've become accustomed to it for, let's say, folks waiting tables. But increasingly, when you go to just a fast food joint or a restaurant and you order at the counter, you get the little iPad, the little tablet nowadays where it prompts you, do you want to tip? And I feel like that's sort of another way of an employer, and maybe a small employer who is struggling with their business, but that's another way of trying to deal with that wage price question by pushing the wages of an employee onto a customer who is grateful in the pandemic for these essential workers doing this. But I both increasingly tip generously, feeling I might be in a position to do so, but don't want to be doing that because I don't think that that's the way the system should be working. So yeah, lots of questions that I think are unresolved at this point, and where we're headed with wages and prices.
Yeah,
Can I jump in? Can I?
Oh, of course, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I want to say in the late 1990s, I was a graduate student at Berkeley getting my Ph.D. and volunteering at the Farm Workers Union. And they had a 1 cent for fairness campaign for strawberry workers. And basically the argument was if we all just paid 1 more cent a pint for strawberries, then the living conditions and wages of the farm workers would actually increase exponentially. Their livelihood would become much better. And these are folks who, I don't know if you know how strawberries are harvested, but they're exposed to methyl bromide, a very cancerous chemical. They have short-handled hoes that lead to long-term disabilities after a lifetime of using these things. So, what Dan says is true. We underpay for a lot of things. I also want to say that, when you bring up the stereotype of the welfare queen, I think it's really important to say that that was a virulently or malignantly racist trope to use. And that when you actually look at the data, what's happening among African-American workers, particularly African-American women, Latinx women, Native American women, is that they are not able at the low end of these jobs to actually have one job and be able to support their families. And so they're working 2 and 3 jobs. And then they are trying to find transportation and childcare to actually work these jobs. And if they don't show up one time, they can be fired. So it's actually the opposite of the trope. Some of the hardest working people in this country are African-American and other minority workers, and particularly women.
And I'll jump in and say too, when you bring up the strawberry harvesting example there too, I mean, there's a deep rabbit hole that we could go down about migrant farm workers as well, and the ways that their labor is quite frequently exploited as well, with the visa process and everything that's wrapped up in that. I mean, there's a lot to talk about there. I am going to pass over here to Daniel Hobbins. So, of course, this event's being put on by the Medieval Institute, and so you may be wondering where that kind of comes in. So, Daniel Hobbins, obviously, labor markets have been a thing for centuries, right? And can you tell us a little bit about the 14th century specifically, because we're talking about the Black Death here, which that's when it occurred. What was the labor market like then?
Right. Sure. So So Black Death, and it refers, as historians use that term, really to the initial outbreak, which is 1347 to 1350. And then you can talk about plague, but Black Death is usually refers to that initial outbreak. So far, the labor market, far more people, the main point is there are far more people working in agriculture in the medieval world. Probably 90% of people of laborers, the people that we would think of as laborers, would be working in agriculture outside of cities. In cities, labor, which are much smaller than our cities today, and that would include towns and villages, labor would be concentrated in, well, if we think of crafts, the craft guilds, which had very strict rules for admission. They're quite different from labor unions. We can talk about that later if you want. But that would include everything from, that term masks a great deal of variety. You could go all the way down to people like tanners who are working with dead animals, and it's a job that's unclean, and they're relegated to certain parts of the city, and all the way up to goldsmiths who are quite wealthy. And then beyond that, a sort of third category would be a merchant class, people who are doing the buying and selling and trading.
So you sort of have your farmers, your artisans, and then your merchant class. Where would was there like a nobility structure at all?
Well, yeah, that's outside of this. I mean, they're not, as the medievals themselves classified their world, they're the people who fight in this, those who pray the church, those who work, the class I just talked about, but really working the soil is what those people are in that scheme. And then those who fight, the noble class, which was a very small percentage of the population.
Kind of like the 1% in a way.
Right.
Yeah. I watch too much TV, and you see that's what we see when we watch the medieval TV, right? We see the nobles and the
right. I mean, the knights are at the bottom of that, and they're working their way up into that class, but they would have thought of themselves as part of the noble class.
Gotcha. Okay, great. Well, tell us about this Black Death, and I mean, what was this plague, and what impact did it have on labor?
Well, it was plague. That's the first point. There was a doubt about that among historians until really quite recently about what disease it actually was. And that's really been settled now through the DNA testing of plague cemeteries. So that's a bubonic plague. The Yersinia pestis is the agent. So that debate is over. There are different forms of it, some that can be transmitted, some from fleas, from rodents to fleas, to humans. Others, another way would be from humans to humans. The estimated death rate for the Black Death is, and that means for that initial outbreak, is really astonishingly high, from 1/3 to 1/2 of the population in Europe.
Wow.
And Europe then doesn't, Europe doesn't recover population that it had before 1348 until the mid-16th century. But it's even worse than that, because then you have the recurrence of plague. Every 10 years it could be. In some places there's probably always plague, but if you're in one city, every 10 years you might get a recurrence of plague. So it becomes a permanent part of the world of people all the way up into the 18th and 19th century. And then late 19th century, you get modern plague showing up, which is, again, related to it might not be exactly the same disease, but it's very close.
So it was sort of the old new normal, if you will.
Right. No, it is. That's right.
Well, there was a big time of upheaval in sort of social classes because of this plague, right? I mean, how did that happen?
Well, everything was in upheaval. If you can imagine. I mean, can you imagine 1/3 to 1/2? We had a tiny percentage of 1%, and here we have 1/3 to 1/2. So it's a scale of mortality that is kind of almost impossible for us to imagine. So yeah, social classes were in upheaval. For a time, everything just completely shuts down. And then what you have is economists can study this, and we know that wages shoot up in over the next century. It doubles the real buying power of people, in part because of a scarcity of labor. So that's relevant perhaps to today's conversation. Prices decline at first, but then they actually go up for a very long time. So that wages are going up, but you aren't able to buy everything more cheaply. And then we have evidence through so-called sumptuary laws of new behaviors of ordinary laborers now demanding meat and quality wines, for instance, and also dressing in a way that was only allowable actually for the noble classes. And we know this because we have laws saying they shouldn't be doing those things. There's this anxiety among the ruling classes about what we might say class, about the class divisions are getting, the lines are getting crossed in ways that they shouldn't. So there's your upheaval.
Yeah, it makes me think of the, our recent talks about inflation, right? Like, and I think about maybe even just gasoline, how this time a year ago, none of us were going anywhere. And so I was able to fill up my car in $20. And I hadn't been able to do that since I was a teenager personally, a long time. And now, of course, gas is going right back up as we're sort of a little bit worried about inflation and trying to see where that goes. It kind of reminds me of that a little bit.
Sure. I mean, we don't have, we should be clear and admit that we don't have the kind of robust data for this period that we have for, it's not even remotely similar. Even population are estimates. But we have enough to have a sense of what's going on. And certainly there was inflation, and wages are rising. So it's actually, arguably for those people who survive the Black Death, it's actually not a bad thing.
Yeah. Well, I do want to come back to you in a little bit with the role of guilds and other things. But I want to pass this over to Dan Graff real quickly, and Tamara, feel free to jump in as well. But Dan, can you just start by reminding us of some of the economic disruptions we saw as a result of the pandemic? I mean, what did we see in the past year and a half or so? And also too, were those things that we saw, were they the result of natural responses to COVID-19, or were they the result of responses to government shutdowns?
All right.
Big question.
Yeah, I mean, all of us lived through this, so maybe some of this is stuff you don't want to remember or you're still in the midst of. I think the disruptions were both government-imposed lockdowns, of course, that attempted to stem the pandemic, plus lots and lots of individual behavior showing up in collective form that shut down many, many parts of the economy throughout 2020. That sent the economy into recession, spiked unemployment. Tamara mentioned that earlier. I think of peaking at something like over 15%, but by some measures, the real unemployment rate was closer to 20%. And then you'll recall, of course, the serious debates, serious and not so serious, but with serious consequences, certainly, about when, how, and on what terms to reopen the economies, first over masks, then over vaccines, now over both. We're still in the midst of it. The work of everyone was highly disrupted, of course, but it was in very different ways, some of which were class-based, right? So many ended up working from home. There's all sorts of implications for that about the home as a paid workplace. It's already an unpaid workplace. And with schools closed, that raised lots of questions. Others lost their jobs or were furloughed, some of them showing up in the unemployment numbers. And then others continue to work as before, right? These essential workers in meat processing plants or grocery stores or hospitals. At the Center for Social Concerns, which is where the Higgins Labor Program that I direct is housed here on campus at Notre Dame, we began a podcast called Speaking of Dignity, Workers on the Front Lines and the Common Good. We did several interviews of just a variety of workers in order to try to capture the diverse experiences. So I encourage people to check that out. Letter carrier, food service worker, frontline nurse, but just trying to get a sense of people's experiences who were defined suddenly as essential workers and got a lot of attention paid to them, even though their own voices weren't often front and center in our discussion. So please check that out. I think the short-term response, primarily of the federal government, was in many ways very surprising and very admirable. You know, I didn't live through the New Deal or the Great Society eras of expanded government, but expanding and extending unemployment compensation, creating paycheck protection programs so employers could keep people on the job, the extension and increase of the child tax credit, strengthening even FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act, giving workers paid time off for dependent care. But all those acts were temporary, right? We're still experiencing some of them, but they're written into law as temporary. And that's a concern to me. So my big takeaway, I guess, from the past year and a half has been that the rhetoric on essential workers has far outrun any policy changes protecting the safety or extending the rights or empowering the voices of those essential workers on the job. Yeah, so I can leave it at that. I don't know if Tamara wants to weigh in as the fellow contemporary scholar.
No, you did a great job. I'll comment on supply chains and trade issues.
No, yeah, I just wanted to give you an opportunity if you wanted to. Yeah. When you talk about PPP, Dan, one of the things, and when you talk to these essential workers as well, one of the things that I heard a lot from people when they were getting unemployment insurance and they were kind of getting this flack, they were getting this sense of flack, right? For like, why are you taking these government benefits? You know, do you deserve these? And then people that I would talk to who were essential workers, they would say, well, how come it is when the businesses get PPP loans, you know, there wasn't a stigma attached to that. You know, if you got $17 million for your small business, that's maybe a lot, that's an exaggeration, but you know, there wasn't as much of a stigma to these PPP loans as there was to people who were accessing benefits. I mean, what does that kind of tell you about our society and maybe how we view work as labor?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I certainly, you know, if you think of just sort of classic capitalist theory, I mean, do we want to follow that in the sense of having an unemployed class of people to keep wages low, right? Certainly government policies in the modern era are designed to, at least in part, ameliorate the problems that people suffer from unemployment. They're supposed to be temporary bouts of it, rooted in no fault of their own, right? The sort of, they're victims of business cycles and the like. But yeah, I mean, I was very supportive of it and still am of robust unemployment compensation. I mean, I think the idea, I mean, we'll talk in a bit maybe about this notion of workers choosing the unemployment benefits rather than returning to jobs. But to me, the unemployment compensation system is not, it's similar to Tamara's point about the welfare queen image. It's not like people are getting rich off the unemployment compensation system. If they can, if somebody can even stay temporarily unemployed and take some benefits, that's an indictment of our pay system more than it is an indictment of an individual worker's choice. But again, sort of historically, the unemployment compensation, right? I described what it was intended to do. It's already quite limited. And it's been deteriorating for the last few decades in terms of the people covered. It's like if wages have been flat in the United States for most workers, which they have, the sort of decline in coverage of the unemployment compensation programs, which are all administered by the states and vary quite a bit. New Jersey has way more coverage of workers, something like 60% are eligible than a state like Florida, where seriously, something like 1 in 10 unemployed workers is covered. So, so even these, in my view, positive expansion of unemployment to cover people not usually covered by the federal benefits temporarily, gig workers, the self-employed, and the expansion of those, the temporary, I think it was $600 a month supplement by the federal government during 2020, and then it was passed again.
600 a week, actually.
600 a week and then 300, I'm sorry. In 2021, when they repassed it after it expired, those are all gone now, right? Those have all ended. There was pretty crappy execution for some. So like a lot of people eligible never even got the pay. So I think we need to think more broadly about what unemployment is supposed to do for somebody who's out of work. But this question about were the expanded benefits preventing people, stopping people from going back to work? I mean, the studies that I've seen by economists, I'm a historian, but I do read economists from time to time, show that the state, because the states have control over this, several, like 26 states, something like half the states, we had a natural experiment, ended the expanded benefits or the supplemental benefits early. And you compare that to the states that didn't, and the states in terms of job performance and unemployment, the states that continued the program had mildly better numbers in terms of unemployment and job creation than the states that ended it early. So I don't think that's the big factor. Again, I'm in favor of it if it's preventing someone from having to go back to work in a job where they're just getting by. Maybe we need to rethink, you know, that the whole system. But any impact was really on the margins in terms of that supplemental unemployment compensation. And again, if it gave some folks leverage, I think that's a good lesson for all of us. I mean, the other thing we often hear is about small business. And, you know, I understand that small businesses have a much harder time absorbing greater labor costs than large businesses. That's a fact. And I understand that, but I feel like how we define what a small business is, how many employees that is, as well as, you know, I feel like the small business is similar to welfare queen, and it becomes a trope or an ideal image, and that it's used to prevent policy making that's going to positively impact millions and millions of workers. I mean, the vast majority of Americans who work for someone else work for an employer that has 100 or more employees. So, you know, 70, 75, 80%, something like that. So, you know, you do have to start thinking about where do we devote the resources that will impact the most people positively.
I think small
Like
businesses.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry? 100 or more, 100 or more, 100 or more. But small business is often defined as 500 or fewer workers. And then if you define it that way, it's a little less than half of those who work for others work for a small business. But if you define it as 100 or fewer, it's like 20, 30%, something like that.
So
You can get in on that?
yeah, I mean, I didn't want to jump in earlier because I know we have a lot to get through. We're dealing with centuries here, but I did want to piggyback on Dan's point too, is that when you think about why people are unemployed or might choose unemployment, a big reason during the pandemic was because their employers were not protecting them, right? So, you know, forcing people back to work in poultry factories, in agriculture, the farm workers. We had doctors dying in New York City because they didn't have appropriate PPE and healthcare workers. Teachers not having proper ventilation, and, you know, there's so many industries. Here at Notre Dame, the faculty, we don't like to think of ourselves as workers, I guess. I do, but you know, we pushed back against the administration on what safety protocols would be put in place, and are still pushing. And faculty around the country are pushing back and demanding that we have better protocols and safety measures. And in fact, there's research that shows that when you look at, there was a really interesting study of nursing homes, 300 and I can't remember how many, almost 355 nursing homes in New York State, found that healthcare, if you actually had a union in a nursing home, that there was a 1.29 percentage point reduction in mortality, which actually represents 30% relative decrease in the COVID-19 mortality rate compared to facilities without unions. So, you know, it also sort of drives me batty to, you know, to hear all these sort of, you know, tropes about, you know, people who just would prefer to be on unemployment, because I think that obscures, you know, what's really going on in people's lives and how they're actually trying to protect themselves. We also had an absolute crisis in childcare during COVID, and that continues. I mean, the first 2 weeks of the school year, my child was not in school. I have the resources to be able to manage that, but most families who are working the kinds of jobs we're talking about absolutely do not. So what do? Do you, leave your 3-year-old at home alone and go to a job, right? So we need to really highlight the realities of working people's lives in this country, and particularly working people at the lower end who have limited choices and options.
Yeah, childcare was a big thing. I've heard a lot in reporting as well. Yeah, people who got caught between quarantines and work, essentially, and you have a child who's too young to maybe do e-learning by themselves. I mean, that was a huge quandary for a lot of people. So I'm glad you brought that up. Tamara, I also want to ask you a little bit about trade. Obviously, global trade has been affected a lot. And that's obviously affected the workforce as well in a lot of ways, because that trickles down, right? From these companies to the workers. How has trade been impacted by the pandemic, and what effects are we still seeing today?
Well, trade, the trade activists, the activists who've been fighting for 35 years for what we call ethical trade, that really meets people's needs instead of just the needs of corporations, have been arguing for decades that we would have a crisis like this. And what we saw in terms of the way that we've been setting up trade policy since the 1970s, which is to really benefit corporations, to undermine sovereignty of different nations, to be able to do domestic manufacturing or production. Some of that is beneficial, and some of it is really problematic when you hit a bump in the road or a boulder in the road. And so what we saw during the height of the pandemic was a real problem with supply chains, where PPE wasn't being manufactured in the United States. One thing I was really concerned with, I do some work in global health, and there was a shortage of medicine. So when you intubate someone who has COVID-19, they get a sedative because it's basically putting a tube into their lungs. It's extremely painful. And most people are in tremendous pain and also try to pull all of these tubes out of them. And so basically we were running low on medication, the sedative and the painkiller that's used to intubate and extubate when people pass away. Patients. We had ventilator shortages. We had shortages of parts for ventilators. And we continue to see these kinds of shortages even today. So, but I think the greatest supply chain failure right now that we can all actually get involved with is that we have a shortage of vaccines around the world, right? So, globally, a small fraction of people have been vaccinated in African countries. Most African countries, fewer than 10% of people have been vaccinated. And this largely has to do with, despite the fact that our money went into all the research to create these vaccines, public money, government money, these pharmaceutical companies still maintain a stronghold on the technology and production. And so, countries in low resource countries are just not being able to produce and have the capacity to produce vaccines for their populations around the world. So, so trade, enters into every facet of how we have been experiencing the COVID pandemic. And I think we need to really rethink trade policies and equitable and ethical trade policies in order to deal with some of these things.
Yeah, and with these shortages and those supply chain shortages going on, I think a lot about how, Indiana is a very manufacturing heavy state, and we're actually also a very big pharmaceutical manufacturing state. We have Eli Lilly kind of, that we think of, and a couple other companies down towards Indianapolis. For a long time, but for a little while in manufacturing, the thing that's been in vogue is sort of the just-in-time, delivery of the parts. That way you don't have to have the warehouse to store the parts. They just come right into the factory, you get them in, you get them right back out. That's obviously caused a lot of these supply chain or a lot of these manufacturing slowdowns because the supplies are coming in slower. Have we seen any changes in that? Any changes in that kind of idea from companies about like maybe we should have one or two warehouses instead of just getting it in and getting it out?
Do you want me to answer that?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's really forced some companies to rethink that. But again, it depends on the sector. It depends on how different kinds of companies are benefiting, right? So right now there's a shortage of the fancy plastic bags that are used to mix chemicals to make medicine. It's not just the COVID pandemic, which is causing the shortage, though. It's caused by the fact that over the last 15 years, 4 firms have bought up the big biopharmaceutical equipment industry. And so none of our government agencies has taken any antitrust action to deal with that. So these firms have tremendous market power. And that means that, they make it so that the bags can only interoperate with their specific mixing machines. It's kind of like, having a ton of coffee and Keurig machines, but not having the Keurig pods to be able to make your coffee, right? It's not a coffee shortage. So some companies benefit from this. The government has gotten involved several times since the 1970s in looking at certain sectors and industries and making recommendations for how, the supply chain and how all of this should be better constructed. With our current trade agreements, it's being considered at the level of the World Trade Organization. But really, a big problem is, that there are benefits to maintaining these kinds of monopolies. We have a crisis in the auto industry right now because of the chips are not being produced. So, we're seeing factories close. So it's just a domino effect, really. But there has to be incentives for the companies to actually change these structures and set up the warehouses or do domestic manufacturing in the United States for some of these products.
Yeah, specifically with that chip shortage, I know the Biden administration has been talking about maybe using the National Defense Production Act. I think that's what it's called. To possibly look at those supply chains and figure out how a government can maybe step in and fix that. I want to jump back into the 14th century really quickly, though. Really hard left turn. We know trade probably wasn't as global in the 14th century as it is today, but I'm assuming trade was probably affected a little bit across Europe during this plague as well, the Black Death, right? I mean, what happened there?
Well, it's a very different conversation when you talk about trade in the 14th century. And so, to begin with, I mean, they don't have the same conception of the need to close borders. Okay, we don't have a germ theory of disease. They do have a notion of contagion. And in fact, they did give people the advice, the very good advice, the plague tracts, which circulated. The best advice they gave was to, if the plague comes, get out of town. So there is this notion of contagion, but not a germ theory of disease. So borders aren't being shut. People are still moving around. And in fact, the late medieval world, the 14th century world, is far more interconnected through trade than, say, the world of 1000 or certainly 800 in the Western Europe. So in fact, the Black Death wouldn't have been transmitted as effectively as it was if this world weren't completely interconnected. Obviously not as much as today. So it's evidence, in a way, the spread of the disease is evidence of a more interconnected world, and that would not change or go away. The period after the Black Death, saw great improvements in maritime transport, bigger ships, nautical tools, which is all the context for the Age of Discovery. So that's the context in which you can talk about trade. It's a very different conversation, but so that's where if we're talking about sort of relevance to today. I think it's interesting, but I don't know that it tells us about the world of today as much as maybe some other things we've talked about.
I'm sure. And it sounds like maybe the biggest, quote unquote, supply chain shortages may have even been from these farmers who many of them, if they were dying, would not be able to
Sure.
bring that food to market, and maybe a food
Right.
shortage or
Sure,
something.
sure, yeah. And there would have been shortages initially. But so, yes, but the conversation, the modern conversation we're having about trade, is just so different. And I think it's challenging. I think it's a great conversation to have, to make these links. But when we get to trade, I find it harder. I find it harder to talk about. It's still worth trying, but.
Sure. No, sure. Well, while we're still in the 14th century, because I want to ask these guys about labor unions, but while we're still in the 14th century, I also want to talk about the role of guilds and how they kind of compare to labor unions. I mean, what
Right.
were the role of guilds?
Sure. So one key difference, the medieval guild, it's fundamental difference, actually. The medieval guild includes both the owners of the industry and those who work in the industry. So it's all one, the masters and the apprentices. The masters own everything. They own the capital. Like, there's no company. There's no, in a way, there's no man, right? So both masters and laborers are part of these guilds. So that's a fundamental difference. Also, the guild was not just a labor organization, it was also a religious organization. There was usually a church attached to it, or that the members attended. There were all kinds of rights and obligations and privileges unrelated to the work itself. So for example, you would have to attend the funeral of one of your members. On the other hand, that meant that when you died, a lot of people came to your funeral. So these were social, very much social, more social than modern labor unions.
So much more like a fraternity almost.
And fraternities, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, cool. Well, Dan Graff, I was going to ask you about unions, right? What's been the role of unions throughout this pandemic and keeping workers safe and also navigating this sort of labor shortage, if we want to call it that, kind of time that we're in?
Yeah, first I want to speak to Dan Hobbins' points though about guilds and thinking about. I mean, a lot of the in an American history context, labor unions formed from some of the same impulses, right? Sort of craft-based. Yeah, the first unions in the United States came out of the crafts when journeymen and apprentices organized in resistance to masters of those crafts getting to speak for them in that sort of old guild system. But the labor unions have always played too this fraternal role. A lot of them as much mutual benefit societies and taking care of their members in times of sickness or the families of members in times of death. So a lot of the roots are the same. This is one of the reasons why I think it's interesting studying the past. It's like, Dan's right that when we think of modern labor unions, we don't think of them in the same social way that we think of medieval guilds. And yet that really just raises a question about the evolution of labor relations and labor unions really only in the 20th century. And it might raise the question, this is a way like you think about the past, contrast it with the present, and then it might make you wonder, have labor unions lost some of that role that they played in an earlier era? I mean, I grew up in a union household. My dad is a retired pipe fitter, and his union had a lot of aspects to it that went beyond enforcement of the contract at work and negotiating the wage. It was, softball teams and picnics. There was all this way to sort of socialize the new members of the craft, so to speak. And so it might raise some interesting questions about the place of unions and what they do today. And maybe, we talk a lot about the decline of social capital in the United States, and not just labor movements decline, but also lots of social organizations that once performed functions similar to these guilds. But I also think it's interesting just thinking about class in the medieval period, or cataclysmic events and the responses of societies, or the role of government in the economy. Is my plug to study history, whether it's the medieval period or the very recent. But I think, wages have been flat in the US, third time I've said that, over the last 4 decades. The deterioration of the unemployment compensation system and other sort of government regulations of the workplace, the Department of Labor's enforcement of wage and hour standards, even the IRS, the sort of government agencies as regulatory bodies and enforcing laws has really declined. And the organized labor has declined precipitously. I think these are all attached to each other. So, you know, from 25% in the end of the 1970s, in the private sector now, we're like closer to 5% than 10%, I think. If you count the public sector, I think there's about 1 in 10 American workers are unionized. So I think, you know, in the midst of this pandemic, unionized workplace, I mean, people often compare and contrast union workplaces to non-union in the same sector to show the wage bump that somebody who's in a union gets from that. But it, to me, in the context of a pandemic, it goes way beyond that. There's just a lot of I mean, unionized workers are more apt to have a healthcare plan. They're more apt to have benefits like the ability to take sick days off or to take personal days to deal with family issues. So, you know, I would argue you're much safer in a unionized workplace in the midst of a pandemic like this, but it's a small percentage of the American population that's in there. And even work rules, you know, the sort of negotiation, the idea that you'd have to negotiate over how a business is going to operate in the midst of a pandemic. And if workers have a voice through the union, a say in negotiating that changes the dynamic. In a non-union workplace, an individual worker can voice her concerns, but you know, she can also be let go without any reason by the employer, unless, you know, the employer is violating civil rights laws. So, yeah, so I think, you know, should I talk a little bit about concrete examples, Justin?
Sure, yeah,
But
yeah.
I mean, just, you know, one concrete examples of the sort of challenges unions have been facing in this moment, as well as some of the protections they've had, like your letter carrier. The letter carriers in the Postal Service are unionized. My local letter carrier, who I know just because he's my letter carrier, I talked to him about, you know, how have they been navigating the pandemic, and the letter carriers have been able to negotiate over the mail that needs to get delivered. They're defined as essential workers under the law, but they were able to negotiate some of the terms of the handling of mail. And just having a voice in that process made my letter carrier feel a lot safer in this process. You remember the early days of the pandemic, we were still wondering, you talk about contagion and germ theory, is it safe to touch mail and touch paper? Last year at Notre Dame, we were not using paper at this time. So
I remember sanitizing all my groceries when we
Yes,
brought them
sanitizing
inside,
the
and we were told
groceries.
later on it's okay. You don't need to do
Right.
it.
So on the other hand, you know, there's limits to even, you know, to what a unionized workplace can do. If people have been following the strike at Nabisco plants across the country over the last few weeks, it was recently resolved. But you know, and this is not about workplace safety in the terms of the pandemic, but it's about worker shortages and the product, getting the product out. I mean, workers at these unionized factories have been claiming that they're working things like 70, 80 hours a week. Now, they get overtime under US law for that, but they're trying to negotiate with the employer to hire more people rather than just to continue to push their own workers. And they're a unionized workforce, but they had to negotiate in their contract limits on the number of hours and shifts they would work, and a requirement for some rest periods that they never thought they needed to have in that contract before. So the employer still has lots of say at unionized workplaces in terms of how work gets done. So
When I remember too, I talked to a guy. He was a local union leader here at the Bendix. They make the
with
the
Honeywell now, or used to
Yes,
work
Honeywell,
with
yes,
Honeywell,
yes.
UAW Local 9.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And I remember they were talking about how they were negotiating with Honeywell, not Bendix, of course, negotiating with Honeywell to just try to find out how many people had COVID-19, how many people had been infected with COVID-19, so that they could better kind of educate their folks on, hey, here's what you should probably be doing, you know, this is how big the problem is. And the company wouldn't tell them. They said, essentially, you know, sorry, they cited HIPAA. A lot of people have cited that incorrectly lately. and that's a role that they've played as well, trying to keep their workers safe just with information, just giving them, here's what's happening on the ground in our factory. So, Tamara, do you have any thoughts on this as well? Because I know you also study the role of unions a lot as well. And what's it been like for unions in present day?
Well, I mean, Dan said that, he cited the statistics of basically union density in the United States, but it's really interesting when you look at how many people want to join a union. So a recent study found that nearly half of all non-union workers, more than 60 million people, would join a union today if given the chance. And so, what I really see is that there's a lot of that the pandemic actually created some opportunities for unions to play a role that became very important in protecting people, right? Because across the board, if you belong to a union, you were much more likely to be safer in your workplace during the pandemic. That's true for low-wage workers. It's true for college professors. So our colleagues in some public universities who are actually able to, who have faculty unions, have been able to ensure that there are mask mandates in the classroom, that there's surveillance testing happening, and which is not true here. And so, that's the opportunity for unions to play that really important role. And then leverage was created for workers, right? I mean, we were all using Instacart and Amazon and all these, companies to get our products. And it created opportunities for workers at Amazon to actually organize. So out of Staten Island, one worker organized because there were not adequate safety protections in the Amazon warehouse in Staten Island. And so what I think we're actually seeing is that the incredible inequalities that workers face, the incredible disadvantage relative to these huge monopolistic corporations, right? In 1970, the average CEO earned 20 times than the average worker, and today that number is over 300 times. So, the disparity is just incredible. But this has allowed workers, and particularly through their unions, to take advantage of the leverage that they have, especially essential workers, to try to make the changes and to show, to kind of serve as models for other workers to actually, demand that their working conditions are improved. So I'm actually a bit hopeful about the impact that the pandemic has had on the ability of workers to see their collective potential and their collective power, even in the face of very challenging employers like the Amazons of the world.
Yeah, well, and speaking of these renewed opportunities and renewed interest in labor right now, I know one of the things that's on the horizon, looking towards the future, that some unions are really pushing for right now is called the PRO Act. I think it's protecting the right to organize. I think is what PRO stands for. Tamara, can you tell me a little bit about that and what significance does that have right now?
So, for decades, unions have, and actually, one could argue that the reason we've seen, one of the main reasons, there's a variety of reasons, but one of the main reasons we've seen union decline in particularly the private sector over the last 50 years has been that we have labor laws that really benefit the employer. To the point that today, 40% of all union organizing elections, in those elections, employers are charged with breaking the law. And they're coercing and threatening workers, and the sanctions are piddly, piddly amounts of money for large corporations to break the law. And there's a whole industry of law firms that are union busting law firms that come in and, you know, sort of take over and do their own campaign to fight the union. Just a massive union bashing, busting campaign in this country. And so what unions have been pushing for, and allied, you know, politicians, members of Congress, presidents, has been an attempt to rectify some of those problems with US labor laws. So the PRO Act would basically restore the right of workers to freely and fairly form a union and bargain together to create those changes in their workplaces. And so it would, you know, would do things like basically allow workers to not be subject to captive audience meetings where the employer forces them into a meeting to tell them how terrible the union would be and things like that. So basically, you know, the hope would be that we would have more successful union drives, because when you would eliminate the unfair practices, you'd actually make it more likely that you'd end up with a union.
I think this is something that we should actually try to, you know, the potential of the 14th century to speak to the present is limited. So I think that you need to find those moments when there really is a lesson to be drawn. And I think this is one when you're talking broadly about the labor conditions. There were laws passed in a lot of places trying to keep people working. In one example, in 1355, the councils in Florence passed a law against rural laborers. Any laborer who refused to work on a citizen's farm or vineyards was declared a rebel. And what that meant in Florence was that you could be executed, perhaps by being burned alive. Excuse me, buried alive, and then have your and then you would have your corpse hung and left to rot. So you know, I mean, it's kind of an extreme case. I mean, where and there were other laws that were nowhere near as punitive, but there could be financial penalties. This is just one example, maybe extreme, but it is representative of laws elsewhere.
All right, so we have some questions here for the audience. I will, oh great, this one's even directed right at you, Dan Hobbins. Is there evidence for increased migration in the aftermath of the Black Death? And how does this impact labor markets?
Yeah, there is. People were moving around. We see various things affecting the economy. I mentioned soaring prices and labor shortage, but also movement of people. And so it's actually, again, the way historians kind of look at this is the greater mobility is people taking skills to new regions. And so that's I suppose the positive you can take from that. We didn't talk much about other kind of, I'm going to sort of springboard from that to a different issue, which we haven't talked about, which I think is actually also relevant when you're talking about the pandemic and the social kind of response to pandemic. On the social level, you get in the medieval period a real desire, and again, this is going to resonate, a desire to cast blame for the disease. And so you get the persecution of Jews and lepers, and then this is perhaps of a piece with a kind of religious hysteria. We get movements of the so-called flagellants, people going around and beating themselves. But I think that the desire to cast blame, there's something eternal there, I think, in the human condition that of course we've all seen when we talk about try to identify the pandemic as coming from a certain place or people. And there may be something real to that too. Of course, it did come from somewhere, but then to sort of blame a certain group of people for being responsible for that, I think is an unfortunate continuity in the human condition.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen it even with COVID-19, certain ethnic groups getting blamed, right?
I do think, could I jump in?
Sure.
This is Dan Graff. for our listening audience. I think it's interesting, thinking about the control of labor, which is what Dan Hobbins was just referencing with the attempt to keep workers from moving for clearly better opportunities or away from worse opportunities. And that runs through American history too. The Black Codes passed out in the wake of the Civil War and Emancipation that really attempted to keep African Americans as an agricultural labor force, or else they would be declared as vagrants if they were moving to the cities, these sorts of things. But, it's interesting to think about labor regulation it's just in general, it can be classified as either attempting to control labor or help employers or those who own the rights to labor to command that labor, laws strengthening that or nodding towards that versus laws that are designed to liberate or empower those working for others. And that's a tension, I think, in government regulatory attempts. So that even just thinking about the unemployment compensation is a more generous unemployment compensation, a liberatory one for workers is a less generous or eliminating it, designed to keep controlling that labor and keep it in its place. I just find that interesting to think about those polls.
Is it sort of blunt to say it's sort of the question of who does the government work for? Does it work for the workers or does it work for the businesses?
Yeah, well, and in a democracy, it's very different than the medieval world, what government is for and who it represents. It is a debate now as to what government is supposed to do and who it's responsive to.
Yeah. Well, Dan Graff, I'm going to throw this at you as well. Various unions have argued for their members' rights not to be immunized. And in the case of many teachers' unions, they have stood in the way of reopening schools, which education experts say has led to declines in school performance and social and mental health challenges. What are the union's obligations to the larger public good during times of crisis like the current situation?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, in general, my argument about workers in unions is it's usually a good thing because it gives workers voice in their workplaces. Doesn't mean that giving people voice results in the best public policy always. So I heard recently the American Federation of Teachers has from the top now changed its position from either ambivalence or local sort of empowering locals to make these decisions, and has now come out in favor of vaccine mandates. So that's a change. The AFL-CIO as a whole, the federation of most unions in the United States, has come out in favor of vaccine mandates as well. But if unions are representations of workers' voice, union members are like other members of the American populace and split on these sorts of issues. So I can see how those would be debated. Interestingly, from what I've been reading in terms of unions on the vaccine mandate issue, it's law enforcement unions that have been the most resistant. And it seems to dovetail somewhat closely with partisanship, I guess, but it's a complicated question. So I think unions are human institutions like any other. So they're not perfect, but I'm as a parent of a public school kid, I'm all in favor of vaccine mandates all across the board, and would be happy to try to persuade a local union leadership, just like a local school board, of why they need to do that.
Oh, sure. I think one example I think of is when Tyson Foods came out and said, we're going to vaccinate our entire workforce. I think it's UFCW, I think, right?
Food and commercial workers represent them. Yeah.
UFCW, I think, came out and essentially said, that's great. We are all for immunization. However, we're not in favor of sort of a mandate because we didn't have a seat at the table when that decision was made. And I think that's been sort of maybe a narrow path or a rocky road, whatever metaphor is the best to use there, about how unions are maybe navigating this.
Principle and process.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which I can understand an elected representative of the workers wanting to have a decision and
Right.
a say in that decision. But
Right, and not be left out.
yeah. But it's interesting at the same time, early in the pandemic, my understanding is the meat packers, the big companies like Tyson's were able to exempt workers in their plants from coverage by many of the regulations that would allow them to say no to going to work in an unsafe environment. And I think that was there was no role of the unionized workers in some of those plants in that decision. But the other thing about the OSHA vaccine, what we call the vaccine mandate of the Biden administration, is really not a mandate. It's just a requirement that workers get at large workplaces in the private sector either get a vaccine or the employer tests them weekly. So even that, when we call it a mandate, is not a mandate. It's there's two options there for that employer and the workers who work there.
And I'll add, I think we're still waiting to see the text on that as well, right? I mean, it's been announced in a speech form, but I don't think we've seen the fine print yet.
Okay.
So yeah, I know I jumped on the phone with several people right after Biden made that speech a couple weeks ago. But Tamara, do you have any thoughts on this as well? Sort of unions' role in protecting the greater good?
Well, I mean, I feel strongly about vaccine mandates. I don't understand how COVID is any different from all the other vaccines we're required to have to go to school and do all the things we want to do. As Dan said, unions are not perfect. And, what people might not realize is we have a lot of autonomy for local unions. And so, what that means is that, unions behave very differently depending on the nature of their structure and their culture. And, unions have made many mistakes over the years. We used to have racial exclusion clauses in certain unions, which were basically to prevent African-American workers from joining the union, which basically excluded them from employment in certain industries. And one thing I would say, though, is that when you have a good union and you have a union that's actually doing education, there's really interesting research on this. So when you have a union where it really is democratic and it really is a collective of the people, the workers, and you're engaging each other and you're making decisions together, and you're not seeing your union as from a clientelistic perspective, right, as the consumer of the organization that's representing you, but a member, an active member of the community. What we see is that those unions that do active anti-racism education, those workers tend to be less racist. When they do gender education, those union members tend to be less bigoted against women. And so what I would say is that, there should be a real effort, perhaps the AFL-CIO should be, creating some kind of education program for their unions across the country that would trickle down to the locals, right? Because we have the AFL-CIO, which is the umbrella organization for most, but not all unions. And then we have the national level unions, and then we have their locals. So, what would happen if we actually did intense education across the United States through unions on the benefits of vaccines? So in some ways you can use a stick, but using a carrot might be a better option in this case. But I feel that unions should be demanding mandates, and I'm happy that the AFT, that Randy Weingarten, changed that position. It's really important that we protect each other. And like I said, most people across this planet are not vaccinated. So this is not over.
Yeah. Well, I think we have time for maybe one last question here. And this one is directed to you, Dan Hobbins. Did the plague and Black Death lead to any changes in public health or the healthcare available to the general public? Yeah, I'm going to kind of leave that at that.
It's not something I know a lot about. There were, especially in the Italian city-states, there were various civic ordinances passed. There were, and some of them were quite, actually, they were not afraid of, at the height of the pandemic, they were not afraid of very serious sort of lockdown kind of conditions of people not moving around. If there was plague identified in that house and no one's coming out. I mean, they were not on the whole question of personal liberty versus the good of common good. They were very much on the common good side. That would not be, most Americans, I think, would not be probably comfortable with. Of course, let's also acknowledge we're dealing with a cataclysm here that does not compare in that way to what we have gone through. So, and incidentally, I teach a course on film. There's not a film out there that has captured that cataclysm either. The best film on the Black Death is The Seventh Seal, which is a wonderful meditation on existentialism, but it's not really, doesn't capture that sense of panic at all. Anyway, that's a bit of a rambling answer, but there's more to public health policy that an expert, again, especially in Italy, and there were there were all kinds of, even before the Black Death, there were rules about sanitation, not up to modern standards. But then those are, I think, even reinforced and made more robust in the aftermath of the Black Death.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah. Well, I think that's about all the time we have for today. Thank you so much to everyone for coming. Let's kind of thank our panelists one more time here. Daniel Hobbins. Thank you. Yeah. We have Tamara Kay here on the screen. And Dan Graff. I do want to kind of plug, if you like this discussion and you want to hear more, the Medieval Institute will continue its 75th anniversary Roundtable series Friday, November 5th at 3 p.m. And this time it'll be on the common good in medieval thought and pandemic debate. The panelists will discuss the idea of the common good and its application to decision-making about public safety during the COVID-19 pandemic. And you can find out more about that at medieval.nd.edu. And then if you're interested in learning more about labor issues and maybe not so much medievals, you can join the Just Wage initiative that Dan Graff here is a part of. It's here at Notre Dame, and their next event will be happening Friday, October 15th at 1 p.m. in the Geddes Hall Coffee House. Scholars and students will be presenting a new framework and online tool that attempts to answer the question, what makes any given wage just or unjust? And they'll bring in some community members as well who advocate for low-income and vulnerable workers in our area. With that, that's it. And we hope you have a great afternoon, everybody. See you next time. Thanks.